Yeah, that's super cool. So let's jump into the real talking shop
Yeah,
part about this. Is a major theme. Just it's across almost every news outlet these days is inflation
yeah,
and recession.
right.
And something that we read about in the news, biased or not, is consumers are struggling with inflation, and food is a major driver. I was reading about eggs the other day, and just
Right.
uh, the, how crazy the price is on eggs, and it's affected a lot of categories. As you think about that, where do you guys see that headed? And I was hoping maybe we could kind of break it down. We don't have to, so it's not
Sure.
one giant question, but just sort of setting the table, no pun intended, for kind of inflation recession from a consumer sentiment perspective,
Right.
from a manufacturer brand perspective, and then from a retail perspective. So I'll let you
Sure.
pick the thread up.
Yeah. So, the way I look at inflation, I don't really look at it from like a quarter to quarter or even on a monthly. Like I keep an eye on that, but I kind of take a step back and say, what is really driving inflation today? So there are a number of factors, right? So one, when you take a look at monetary policy and even fiscal policy, and I'll kind of use the great financial crisis as a starting point, right? What was significant back then in 2008 is the government started to experiment with the balance sheet in a way that historically they never have, right? So when remember the great big bazooka that they when during the at that time it was like almost $1 billion, right? And everyone was like, oh my goodness, like what are we doing? But since then, look what has happened, right? Since COVID, we started trillions of dollars are going into the economy, right? And this has never happened. So the amount of money that's been pumped into the system is really a underlying driver of inflation, right? So, people like to use helicopter money, as a term, and that's really what has happened. There's so much money sloshing around in the economy, and when you take a look at since 2008 up until COVID, it's been you look at inflation, it's like target 2%, right? And normally, my view is that when there's so much experimentation in kind of fiscal and monetary policy, eventually there's going to be a downfall, or the effects, the ramifications of that are going to play out. And so that's what we're seeing today, right? We're seeing the effects of experimental fiscal and monetary policy. Obviously, COVID was a big driver as well, right? It basically stopped the economy, and once the economy started roaring back, consumers started buying like there was no tomorrow, right? They were buying everything, right? They were buying cars, and they were, all that money that went, that the government pumped in to shore up, consumers' wallets. Like they spent it on everything, right? And so
Yeah.
the economy wasn't prepared for that amount of demand, right? So going back to your question specifically on consumers still are purchasing, very aggressively, and even in places like China, you're starting to see even kind of a global demand from the consumer, that's pushing the supply in a way that's driving up prices, right? And so
Yeah.
my view is that this is not a temporary phenomenon, right? I think at least in this next season, and when I say the season, over the next 3 to 5 and maybe even 10 years, we will be at elevated inflation, especially in the food sector. Now, I'm hoping that eventually it comes back down, but we're in a new era of elevated inflation, so the consumer is will be affected. Grocery bills are $100 for a family of four, $100 more than what
Hmm.
they bought previously in pre-COVID, right? So the consumer is tight strapped right now. The economy, especially with the economy starting to slow down. Many economists are predicting a some sort of like a recession. Now, depending on how severe it is, it might happen in the back half of this year. Um, so it's sort of like two big events. You have inflation and you have a slowing economy, right? And a lot of jobs have been lost,
Mhm.
since the beginning of the year, especially on the tech sector. So I do think will these two themes will continue throughout the next couple of years, and I'm hoping there won't be another war, or escalation of war, whether it's in Ukraine,
Mhm.
Russia, or other parts of the world. But that's how I see the world today. It's sort of like slow growth, potentially a recession, and elevated inflation
Yeah.
across the board.